Okay, I'm going to begin in Hebrews 5 and really about verse 8 this morning. But I will ask if anyone has any questions over what we went over last week that I can answer in a couple minutes. No questions. Okay. Hebrews 5 and verse 8, that though he were a son, yet learned he obedience by the things which he suffered. And if you look at your outline, it shows that verses 8 and 9 shows that Jesus also had something to offer. When it says he was a son, its son is without the definite article. It's not though he was the son, but a son. But the emphasis is on the nature of something. Many times they would leave the definite article off if they're dealing with the nature of whatever it is. And so here it was, even though he was a son by nature, and thus it shows his deity. He was the very God of the very God. But it's showing he had the nature of God, or nature of son. Yet he learned obedience. And we could tie that in with Luke 2 and verse 52, where Jesus grew in wisdom, stature, favor with God and man. Increased. Not great. That's what was throwing me off. He increased in wisdom, stature, favor with God and man. So you see the same thing, a progression, a learning process of Jesus. And he learned obedience. Well, this ties in certainly with Philippians 2 and verse 8, that though he was found in fashion of a man and became obedient unto death, even the death of the cross. In fact, a great deal of Hebrews ties directly back to Hebrews 2, 5, or 6 through 9. Dale?
Was it at his baptism by John the Baptist in the Jordan when he got the Spirit without measure, or did he have it without measure his whole life? Or do we pinpoint a time? Or does it matter?
It doesn't matter. Okay. It's a theoretical discussion that really has no bearing on anything.
He must have had it when he was 12 because he was teaching them.
Well, that's why I say it's a theoretical discussion. Obviously, the Spirit descended on him as like a dove at his baptism. So it's a theoretical discussion that doesn't matter.
They say something about it. It wasn't his ability to use it until he was a man or something like that when he turned of age.
Well, in becoming man, he obviously emptied himself of certain things. The very fact, how could a omniscient God who became man learn? How could he increase in wisdom if he's already all with God? And so there has to be certain elements that he emptied himself of in becoming man. Thus, in learning and increasing in wisdom, stature, favor with God and man, there is an increase in that. There is a learning process. So was he all-knowing during that time?
It could be reflecting on the fact that what he was learning was the human side.
How can you separate the divine and the human side?
Well, if you're never been human, how could you ever really know what a human was?
How could
That'd be
you?
like you're trying to explain what a dog feels like without being a dog.
Yeah, but he's the creator.
He's God, he knows it all anyway.
That's the problem with that. You're trying to compare a finite being with an infinite being, that infinite being being the creator of those things. He is also omniscient and all powerful, all wise, everything. That's why I say there is a process, obviously, of emptying himself and becoming man, giving up some of those prerogatives of deity, and becoming.
Still, you have to look at that. There was some reason that he had to become man in order to be our Savior.
Well, the very fact that we said last week, he became man for the express purpose of dying on the cross. But here he learned obedience. Again, how can a divine being learn an increase? It is dealing with the fact that he emptied himself.
That would be quite a step down to be humble and obey your parents when you created the stuff that caused your parents to come into existence. I think on humility.
A lot of people look at the time in the garden, and this goes back to what we were discussing last week a little bit, as this major stepping stone in relationship to the cross. Hogwash. That wasn't anything in relationship to emptying himself and becoming man. If you look at the wording of Philippians 2, that he was in the form of God, thought it not robbery to be equal with God. And he left that to become man. That's, if I can liken it to two sacrifices and which one's greater, leaving that aspect and becoming man, to me, would be far greater sacrifice than the sacrifice of the cross and his death on the cross.
But his desire to give man a chance kind of outweighed that, apparently.
Well, certainly, that's the whole reason he came to this earth.
To be empathized with people's needs.
But that doesn't change the sacrifice there was in leaving that equality with God and humbling himself. And that goes back, he learned obedience. Well, question, who could God be obedient to? No one, could he? Only by becoming man, thus through his incarnation, could he render obedience to anyone. And so, by and as a man, he learned by experience what obedience was. Thus he learned obedience. Since God himself could not be, when he becomes man, he can learn obedience. And then by the things which he suffered, he learned obedience by his suffering. That is the means by which he is going to be perfected. Which is verse 9, being made perfect. He became the author of eternal salvation unto all them that obey him. So through that suffering, and obviously this is dealing with his death on the cross, he was made perfect. Word perfect. T-E-L E-I-O-O. Teleio. And it is an aorist tense, which is what? Y'all remember?
Point action?
Okay, point action or completed action. And it is passive. Remember we talked about that a couple of weeks ago as opposed to being active, passive voice, active voice. And active is you are doing something, passive is it is being done to you. Here it's an aorist passive, thus being perfected. He learned obedience by the things which he suffered. Being perfected. So here it is regarding persons. This word, teleoo, has the idea of bringing the person to the goal that is fixed by God. I got that someplace, I don't remember where, but I like the definition of it. It is coming to that point, that goal that God has set for you. He became the author of eternal salvation. We looked at this word a little bit when we were back in chapter 2 and verse 3, and again in chapter 2 and verse 10. We looked at several words actually in relationship to this. I think more when we got to verse 10, for it became him for whom are all things, and by whom are all things, and bringing many sons to glory, to make the captain of their salvation perfect through suffering. In 2:3, it is which first began to be spoken by the Lord. Here's this great salvation which first began to be spoken by the Lord. There it is arche, which means the beginning or the cause. In 2:10, where it says the captain of their salvation, it's the Greek word archeologos, which means the author or originator, the founder, the leader. Here it's aitios, meaning the cause or the source. So you have three words there. We talked a little bit more about it when we were back in chapter 2, so I won't spend a great deal of time here with it. Just refer to your notes back then. So, being perfected, he became the cause or the source of eternal salvation to them that obey him. Now then, we could probably spend 20 or 30 minutes just going over scriptures that emphasize our obedience to God, that we are to obey him. And Romans 6:17 and 18 shows that our obedience, we could look at it from the standpoint of the fact that Jesus was obedient. He came to do the will of him that sent him. We could see it from the standpoint of if we fail to be obedient, if we're not obedient, then we're going to be destroyed. 2 Thessalonians 1 verse 8 and other passages. But obedience is an integral part of becoming a Christian and remaining a Christian. Now, if you're dealing with here eternal salvation, well, eternal salvation would include both of those aspects: initial obedience in becoming a Christian, and then continued obedience in living the Christian life. Now then, how would that be in relationship to who Paul is writing to? Remember the purpose of the book? What is it?
Show Christ's superiority, the church's Christ's superiority.
Okay, shows the superiority of Christ in the Christian system. Why was he writing it? That's maybe what I...
Because the Jews were falling back into Judaism.
Right. They were going to depart Christianity and return to Judaism. So what's the emphasis? Continued obedience. Here he has become the author of eternal salvation. He's the one who brought this forth. He's the source of it, the cause of eternal salvation. But to whom? Only those that continue to obey. It's not going to be for those who fall back into Judaism. And we're going to discuss that a little bit more toward the end of the class this morning. Verse 10, he is called a high priest. Called of God, a high priest after the order of Melchizedek. Called is a word which literally means to address or to salute, to greet. But it also can mean to designate or give a name to. And that's probably the emphasis that is found here in this verse. He is called, in the sense that he has been given a name of God as a high priest after the order of Melchizedek. And has been addressed that way or saluted that way. And the high priesthood of Christ after the order of Melchizedek, if you go back to the 110th Psalm, we could study that in relationship to that. That's where so much of it is prophesied. We could also tie in Zechariah 6 and verse 13, that here he shall be a king upon his throne, and also he would be a priest on his throne, or upon his throne. And that clearly shows that the kingship and the priesthood of Christ are at the same time. As we go through Hebrews, we find that he's priest in heaven. Therefore, where's his kingship? It's got to be in heaven, not on earth. So here, though, within the context that he's called of God a high priest after the order of Melchizedek, is that God has given him this name, high priest after the order of Melchizedek, because he had completed his earthly action of causing our salvation. If he had not done that, completed that action of causing our salvation, then he would not have been a high priest after the order of Melchizedek. So he is called of God, and that also, if you remember, I think we discussed it last week, that he didn't take that of himself. No man takes it of himself and can be guiltless. God has to give one into that priesthood, and so here he is called of God, designated by God as a high priest after the order of Melchizedek, because he had completed that work in completing our salvation. Okay, chapter 5 and verse 11, and going through chapter 6 and verse 20. There's some admonitions and exhortations now. In verses 11 through 14 of chapter 5, their spiritual status, which is lacking knowledge, or lack of knowledge. In verse 11, they were hard to teach and dull of spiritual understanding. He says, of whom we have many things to say and hard to be uttered, seeing ye are dull of hearing. Of whom? literally is concerning whom or concerning which. Well, concerning whom or concerning which in relationship to what? What's he mean here? Well, there's three options: Christ, Melchizedek. It's not either one of those. Of whom we have many things to say. He doesn't have many things. It's not that he has many things to say concerning Christ. It's not he has many things to say concerning Melchizedek.
After the order.
It's the high priesthood of Christ after the order of Melchizedek that he has much to say. Yeah, the order of, but it's the high priesthood of Christ after the order of Melchizedek. Have many things to say to you. We probably is an editorial we. We have many things to say. We use that in an editorial way many times. When you're saying I, and instead of saying I, you use we. It's called an editorial we. Hard to be uttered. Interesting phrase in the original. It literally would be translated difficult or hard of interpretation to speak. Difficult of interpretation to speak, or hard of interpretation to speak. In other words, what he's saying is it's difficult to explain to you because you're dull of hearing. And we'll get to that dull of hearing in a minute, but because it's an interesting word. I enjoy that word. But that's the idea that's being presented. It is difficult to explain this to you because you don't have any spiritual understanding. Or to put it real crass, I guess, it's difficult to explain to you because you're ignorant. Now then, that's the crass way of saying it, and yet it's the truth because they were willingly ignorant. Yeah.
He said the same thing to people in Athens.
Well, he told them there wasn't any reason to be that way anymore.
Right.
The word dull. ROS, I believe. Yeah. Just want to make sure. Nothros. And I say I like this word because it's made up of two parts. I-N-O, which is no. Actually, that would, I think, no, that's right. It actually comes from N-E, would be more accurate. It has reference to no. Then the other part, Othros, really, T-H-E-I-N, means to push. No push. That's what he's literally saying. You have no push.
Is that not no initiative?
Yep, no initiative.
He's telling me that you aren't very curious and you aren't very, don't have much initiative. Is that what he's saying?
No initiative. No push. You see some individuals and they are pushing all the time. I mean, everything that they do, they're just such a exertion that they have in relationship to that action that they surpass everyone else. That's the opposite of no push. They have push. These people didn't. It's a word that's found 2 times. This is one of the times, and in chapter 6 and verse 12 is the other time.
In the whole New Testament?
Yes. And there it's translated slothful. Be not slothful. Well, be not no push. You have push. You need to have initiative. But they didn't. It also indicates, though, that it was voluntary. Sometimes you need to get some initiative, you tell someone.
That would be really good for school teachers to use. I like that push.
That's why I said I like the word. I mean, it is a great word. It's so descriptive. You don't have any push. There's no initiative. There's nothing in you to really get you moving.
But isn't that like so many people in the church today?
Absolutely. That's the problem. It is so much like so many. How many members of the church sit in the pew for decades and really never learn anything about the Bible? Not procrastination. They just don't have any push.
Too busy watching the idiot box and everything else.
They're doing everything else. They've allowed everything to push out God. They don't have any initiative in relationship to spiritual matters. They have no push.
Relationship because that's, everybody has push. It's just they choose where are they
going to push. Yeah. Although I might wonder with some individuals if they have any push in relationship to anything, but sometimes it's hard to find it.
Yes.
But yeah, members of the church today, he is describing so many members of the church today. And a lot of them that supposedly have some initiative, really all that they want is very little snippets. How many members of the church today do you see that want to go home and study the Bible? That means, and not just reading it, that means going through it and finding out who's writing it, who he's writing it to, the context of it, look at all of the words that are found in it.
Acts 28, 27. From the heart of this people is waxed dross, and their ears are dull from hearing, and their eyes have been closed, lest they should see with their eyes and hear with their ears, and understanding with their heart, and should be converted.
Which is a quote, or which is also used by Jesus in Matthew 13 and 15. And I think it's a quote from Isaiah. I don't remember exactly where they're.
6, 9, and 10.
6, 9, and 10, okay.
Which book
But
in
there,
Revelation, which letter in Revelation was to one of the churches that had lost their first love?
that was Ephesus.
That was
Revelation 2 and well, it starts in verse 1, but that's probably in verse 4 or so. They had left their first
when
love.
someone is newly baptized, they are.
You see a lot of zeal, generally. And over time, they lose the zeal. But I say I love this word, just no push. There's nothing there that's driving them anymore. These individuals that Paul was writing to here, they should have continued to have that driving force behind them, and they didn't. Just had no push. And he says, ye are. Perfect tense. What does perfect tense mean? What does it mean?
It means
Completed action in the past with continuing results. So here, you are what? This is what you were in the past with continuing results. Ye have become. This is the idea that the way it would be translated. Ye have become dull of hearing. You have become no push in the past, and you continue to be that way. Well, we could talk a lot about that, but verse 12. They have been instructed, though. For when the time ye ought to be teachers, ye have need that one teacher again, which be the first principles of the oracles of God, and are become such as have need of milk and not strong meat. The word order in Greek on this is interesting. He says, for when ye ought to be teachers for the time. That would be the word order in the Greek. The word for there, for the time, is the Greek word dia, which means through, literally. But it carries the idea here of by reason of time. By reason of time. What? You should have been teachers. Time is interesting. It is. Sure, it just. Anyone recognize that word?
Yep.
Chronos. Chronology, someone said. What is that? It's dealing with time. Here, it is time as a period measured by a succession or the succession of objects and events, and denotes the passing of moments and thus a definite portion of time having limits. By reason of the length of time they had been under the instruction of teachers, they ought to be teaching the same. That's the idea. You've had a length of time that you've been under teachers, and it's long enough that you should have now become a teacher yourself. The word ought is a Greek word which means to owe or to be indebted to. And thus it is a moral obligation. You had a moral obligation to have become teachers, seeing the length of time that you've been under teachers. And does that say something to some Christians who spend decades under teachers and they still can't teach a lick? You have a moral obligation. That word also is used in chapter 2 and verse 17 and chapter 5 and verse 3. You ought. You have need that one teacher again, which be the first principles of the oracles of God. Word first there is that Greek word arche. Means beginning or the cause. Here, the beginning of things. You need that one teach you the beginning of things, the principles of the oracles of God. The Greek word principles means the rudiments or the elements, the basic parts of something. You get a scientist, he examines something and he can tell you the basic elements that goes into the makeup of that. Well, that's the idea of the word here. Here's the basic elements of something, the principles of it. The word oracles, logion, it means and has reference to divine utterances. It's a word used in 1 Peter 4:11, that if any man speak, let him speak as the oracles of God. Same word. And are become such as have need of milk and not strong meat. Are become is perfect tense again. Completed action, continuing results. Thus, you are become, or come into existence and begin to be, would be a better translation, really. It's come into existence and begin to be, such as have need of milk instead of strong meat. The word strong literally is solid or firm meat. And meat would be used in reference to food in general. It's not as we would think of meat like steak or something like that, but food in general. So you've had enough time when you should be, because of the length of time that you've been under teachers, you have a moral obligation where you should have been teaching. But you're not that way because why? You've had no push. Voluntary action. And so what needs to be taking place? Well, you need to be taught the first principles of the oracles of God, those elementary principles of God's Word, the divine utterances, or become such as need milk and not strong meat. Verse 13, for everyone that useth milk is unskillful in the word of righteousness, for he is a babe.
Isn't there a place where you just said you take you're taking even that which you think you'll lose it. You don't use it, you'll lose it. Is basically what he said. Christ said that somewhere. It reminded me of that. Taking away that which you think he had. It reminds me of that.
Well, it's really not a parallel.
It's not.
No. Because there you had something and you lost it. These didn't have it.
Oh.
You became this in the past and you continue to be this. Because you didn't have any push. You should have learned, but you didn't learn.
Opportunity was there.
The opportunity, they had the opportunity to become such, and they had the moral obligation to become such. They just didn't do it. So they never had it. What you're talking about is someone who has it, and he loses it because of inactivity. And while that's true, that will happen, that's not the situation here. Useth is from, and we looked at this word before, but it means to have together with others, to partake in or to share in. Everyone that useth, partakes in, shares in. And here shares in ordinary feeding. The word that's translated useth is also found in Hebrews 2 and verse 14 and Hebrews 7 and verse 13. He is unskillful. Unskillful literally is inexperienced. He's inexperienced. And he is a babe. Get this word chronos off. Notice I left teleoo because there's a parallel or a contrast that's being made here. Babe, N-E-P I-O-S. Nepios, pios. And its meaning is infant. one lexicographer put it that says it is used in a figurative way of one who is fed with the milk of elementary teaching, as contrasted with teleos, which is a mature person who can take the solid food of the main teaching. So there's a contrast. Teleos, teleoo, and nathios, one who has reached the goal that God has set for him, teleos, as opposed to an infant. One who can take strong meat as opposed to one who is still on the milk. And verse 14 thus, but strong milk belongeth to them that are of full age, who, even those who by reason of use have their senses exercised to discern both good and evil. Full age now is this word, that's the verbal form, change the ending to s for the noun form. Teleos, one who's full age. He said, you're infants. Strong meat belongs to those who are full age. They're teleos. Now, what was Jesus? He became perfected, teleos, teleoo, by the things which he suffered. Here the word use is strong meat belongeth to them who by reason of use, word use there is habit or practice or exercise. By reason of habit, they continued to practice this, have their senses. It means the faculties, and to perceive with the external senses. Good and evil. Good and evil here has reference to doctrine, not moral qualities. You cannot discern between good doctrine and evil doctrine, in other words, because you're babes. What's happening in the church today? People cannot discern between good and evil, good doctrine and evil doctrine, because they are babes. They've never had any push within themselves to really dig down and learn the truth. Now then, in chapter 6, verses 1 through 3, the idea is to go on to perfection. I'm going to introduce this. We'll talk about more next week, Lord willing. But what is the contrast that is being made here? Leaving the principles of the doctrine of Christ. Let us go on to perfection. What's he talking about now?
Mosaic law.
Mosaic law. Somebody started to say something.
Isn't that what you were just talking about, the basic teachings?
Basic teachings.
That we were just talking about?
The foundation, let's build upon the foundation that's already laid.
Okay.
Let's not go back to it, let's continue on.
What would be those basic foundations?
Plan of salvation.
Plan of salvation.
And related matters, modifying it.
Okay, no, that's not it. And we'll discuss it more next week. He's dealing with Old Testament.
Oh, really?
Look at the contrast. Consider he's making a contrast. Here's Old Testament things, New Testament things. What are these Jews in danger of doing? Going back to Old Testament things. Those elementary things. What do you need? You abandon those things. That's the word leaving. And you go on to perfection. What's perfection? It's the New Testament system. But we'll discuss it more next week.